Early morning on Albania's southern coast. Trucks have arrived in the night. Not unusual trucks, construction vehicles, excavators, fencing material, men in private security uniforms. What makes this unusual is where they have arrived. They are in the Vjosa Narda protected landscape, a coastal wetland, one of the last river deltas in Europe. It's home to flamingos, Mediterranean monk seals, loggerhead sea turtles, and more than 200 bird species, a region designated protected land since 2004. No project has been published. No environmental impact assessment has been completed. No public consultation has been held. No valid permits, at least not ones that have been made public. When a protester approaches to document what's happening, a private security guard grabs them and drags them inside the fence. Police officers are present, but they do not intervene. Within 24 hours, Tirana is in the streets. Within 1 week, more than 100,000 people have marched through Albania's capital. Demonstrators are carrying inflatable flamingos, and they're chanting in Albanian, "Albania is not for sale," and also, "Rama in prison, Berisha in prison." Two names, the Prime Minister and the former Prime Minister, the Socialist and the Democrat, both. The protesters aren't replacing one party with another. They are rejecting a system. This is the Flamingo Revolution. And to understand why it exploded the way it did, why this specific moment, this specific project, in this specific country, you have to go back much further than Jared Kushner. You have to go back to a country that nearly destroyed itself, that was rebuilt from nothing twice, and that has been governed ever since by two parties who learned to survive by sharing the spoils. Let's get into it. Welcome back to the show, or welcome if this is your first time. My name is Valda Salimai, and I am your host. You are catching me at a very Albanian time in my life right now. Albania has been front and center in the news with this Kushner project, with Edi Rama, with corruption in the government, the Flamingo Revolution, and this is just something I want to use my platform to help educate about what is happening in Albania, because I can tell you right now, this event is not a singular event. It is one of many. It's a pattern that we're going to explore. So whether you're new here or you're a listener, both thank you for being here. I want to just help educate and give you the backstory of why what's happening in Albania is so big, because it's not just about land anymore. It's so much bigger than the land. To understand Albanian politics in 2026, you first need to understand Albanian politics in 1946. That was the year Enver Hoxha consolidated total power over the country. And when I say total, I mean total. Hoxha's Albania was, at various points, the most isolated state on earth. More isolated than North Korea. Albania broke with Yugoslavia in 1948, with the Soviet Union in 1961, with China in 1978. And by the end, Albania had zero functioning diplomatic relationships with any major power. The country had been declared, by official decree, the world's first atheist state. Religion was banned, churches and mosques were turned into warehouses, and priests were even executed. Hoxha died in 1985. The regime that he had built survived him by 6 years. So when it finally collapsed in 1991, Albania emerged with no real functioning institutions, no civil society, no free press, no tradition of political pluralism, and a population that had never, in living memory, had been allowed to organize around anything other than survival. What happened next follows a pattern that political scientists call institutional capture, when a transition to democracy happens so fast that the old power networks reorganize before new institutions can form. So the Democratic Party won Albania's first free elections in 1992. But as researchers at the University of Edinburgh noted, its institutions were weakened by limited experience and knowledge outside of communist ideology. So there was no playbook, there was no precedent, and the people who knew how the state actually worked, so like its bureaucrats, enforcers, information brokers, they were mostly products of the old system. So two parties came to dominate the landscape. The Democratic Party, which was led by Sali Berisha, and the Socialist Party, which is a direct institutional successor to Enver Hoxha's Party of Labor. Not a break, it was not a new formation, and it was definitely not a rebrand. The party preserved its organizational networks, its regional power bases, and in many cases, its key family and patronage structures. Now this matters. It matters because it means that from the very beginning of Albanian democracy, one of the two dominant parties was staffed, in significant part, by people who had learned to govern under a totalitarian system. But in 1997, there was a crash that changed everything. And because we're going to get into Edi Rama in just a little bit, but before we get to him, we have to talk about 1997 because this was a defining trauma of modern Albanian political life. In the mid-1990s, Albania was experiencing what the International Money Fund, IMF, called a quote-unquote success story of free market reforms. The country was growing at 8% a year, and filling that vacuum of newly free money were a series of investment funds offering extraordinary returns, 10% a month, 20, 40. In retrospect, that was an embarrassing thing for the IMF to say because they were all pyramid schemes. And by late 1996, approximately 2/3 of Albania's 3 million people had invested in them. People sold their homes. Immigrants sent their savings from Italy and Greece. The total value of deposits is estimated about like $1.2 billion. So that's roughly half of Albania's GDP at the time. In January 1997, they collapsed. And that aftermath was catastrophic. The government lost complete control of the South. The army and the police deserted. Armories were looted across the country. Foreign nationals were evacuated. The prime minister resigned. The president declared a state of emergency. And by the time order was restored, approximately 2,000 people had been killed. What the pyramid crisis did, beyond the immediate human cost, was just destroy what little remained of public trust in institutions. The government had not just failed to stop the schemes, officials had actually endorsed them. And when they collapsed, the state couldn't even maintain basic security. That loss of trust never fully recovered. It created a political culture where Albanians expect the state to act in its own interest, not theirs. Where corruption is not an exception, but rather it's the operating model. Now, since 1992, Albanian politics has been a duopoly. The socialists and the Democrats, they trade power, accumulate corruption scandals, they attack each other relentlessly, and return to office. And according to Freedom House's 2024 Nations in Transit report, Albanian political parties remain unable to address corruption in their own ranks, affected by a lack of internal democracy and self-regulation, both parties, across their entire histories. And then Sali Berisha, who led the Democrats as president from 1992 to 1997, and as prime minister from 2005 to 2013, is currently under criminal investigation by Albania's anti-corruption prosecutors. And he's been sanctioned by the U.S. government. And then there's Edi Rama, who has led the Socialists since 2005 and governed as prime minister since 2013, has seen his deputy prime minister, his former environment minister, and the mayor of the capital, a man widely seen and considered as Rama's political heir, all indicted on political charges. The protesters today in Albania, 2026, they're not naive about any of this. When they chanted Rama in prison, Berisha in prison, They were making a structural argument. The problem is not the man. The problem is the machine. Okay, so now let's get to Eddie Rama. Let me tell you who Eddie Rama is, because he's not just some cartoon villain in this whole story. And understanding why he's effective is part of understanding why Albania's corruption problem is so hard to solve. And as somebody who went to school for leadership, my master's is in organizational leadership, I just have a lot of thoughts about Eddie Rama as a leader. But I'm going to give you some backstory first. Rama was born in 1964 in Tirana. He's 6'7", so he's famously like the tallest head of government in the world. He's also a trained painter, a trained writer, a former professional basketball player. He speaks multiple languages. The man's even given a TED Talk. He is perceived as sophisticated, charismatic, and politically brilliant. All characteristics of great leadership. Rama, he also carries a very complicated family history that his political opponents never let him forget. His father was a celebrated sculptor of the communist regime. You know, the kind of artist who he made monuments to the state and then received state privileges in return. His father was also a member of the Presidium of the People's Assembly, a body that reviewed clemency appeals from families of political prisoners. In 1988, Rama's father participated in that body that rejected the clemency appeal of a poet who dissented against communism named Hoxha Nela. And Nela was actually hanged on August 10, 1988. And he was the last execution of an artist under the communist regime. And Eddie Rama's father was partly responsible for that. Now, I mention this not to hold Eddie Rama personally responsible for his father's choices. That would be unfair, right? I mention it more so because it illustrates something important about institutional continuity. The party Rama leads is the literal successor organization to the party that executed Nela. That's not an insult. It's just historical fact. And it matters for understanding the culture that party carries forward. Now, speaking about Rama, to his credit, Eddie Rama's government has delivered changes, real changes. Albania joined NATO in 2009, but before his tenure, but has progressed significantly towards EU membership under his leadership. So, accession negotiations opened in October 2024. By late 2025, Albania had opened all negotiating clusters. Economic growth has been solid. The World Bank reported 3.4% growth in the first quarter of 2025. Tourism in Albania has exploded to represent 25% of economic output. Over 12 million tourists visited Albania in 2025, generating over $5 billion in revenue. Now, in 2019, under significant EU pressure, Albania established SPAC, the Specialized Structure for Anti-Corruption and Organized Crime. Before SPAC, high-level corruption cases in Albania were essentially never prosecuted. I mean, of course, why would they be? After SPAC, they have been. The mayor of Tirana, right? Remember I talked about the former environment minister and the former deputy prime minister and ex-president, all facing serious charges. The Christian Science Monitor ran a piece in August 2025 calling Albanians, quote unquote, cheering a corruption cleanup. That was a real thing. People were genuinely hopeful that the corruption was getting cleaned up. Okay, but here's the counterweight. Here's the opposite of that. Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index gave Albania a score of 39 out of 100 in 2025. So that was a 3-point drop from the year before, ranking the country 91st out of 182 states. So that puts it below the accepted EU threshold of 50 and among the lowest ranked in Europe. According to their Global Corruption Barometer, approximately 1 in 4 Albanians reported paying a bribe to access public services. 1 in 4. A 2025 economic study estimated that corruption cost Albania somewhere between 852 million and 1.1 billion euros annually, which is equivalent to 3.1 to 4% of GDP. That's an estimate. That's not a subtle figure. But even the conservative and represents an enormous drag on a country of this size. And that same study projects that if corruption levels remain unchanged, Albania could lose between 2.8 and 4.8 billion euros in cumulative economic output by 2030. There's also the shadow economy. Albania's informal economy is estimated at 30 to 35% of GDP, so roughly about 8 to 9.5 billion euros, compared to an EU average of about 10%. Now, some Albanian analysts, and I'll be careful here because this comes from a politically interested source, have alleged that Albanian criminal networks launder significant proceeds from drug trafficking through construction sector. The allegation is difficult to independently verify, but what is not disputed is that money laundering cases in Albania are rarely prosecuted, with only SPAC taking action against them, and that SPAC has repeatedly found what it found. The moment that changed everything, though, was the Balaku case. So Belinda Balaku was Rama's deputy prime minister and infrastructure minister. She oversaw nearly 3.8 billion euros in infrastructure spending between 2024 and 2026. In October 2025, SPAC indicted her on charges of manipulating public procurement procedures, basically rigging public tenders. Here's what happened next. Rama, who had spent years insisting he would not interfere with SPAC, criticized the prosecutors. He delayed dismissing Balaku from her position until February 2026, 4 months after the first charges were filed. He also proposed new legislation that would prevent courts from suspending ministers under criminal investigation. And in March 2026, his Socialist Party's parliamentary majority voted 82 votes against to block SPAC's request to lift Balaku's parliamentary immunity. The EU delegation in Tirana responded pointedly, stressing that a credible environment for SPAC was essential for session progress. So this Balaku episode did something specific to Albanian public consciousness. It confirmed what many Albanians had suspected, that SPAC was tolerated as a reform institution as long as it prosecuted the other party. The moment it came for someone at the heart of power, the rules changed. One more number before we move on, because it matters for everything that follows. Albania is bleeding its future. Labor shortages from emigration have become a structural economic problem. A 2024-2025 study of medical and nursing students found that nearly 40% expressed a desire to work abroad, citing better pay, better living standards, and personal freedom. When the people most likely to build functioning institutions leave, the institutions that remain just become easier to capture. That is the Albania into which Jared Kushner arrived on a yacht in 2021. In July 2021, Ivanka Trump and her husband, Jared Kushner, took a private trip to Albania. They traveled the entire coastline on a yacht owned by Nathaniel Rothschild, a British financier and a longtime friend. And that name should sound familiar. At some point during that trip, they swam to Sazan Island. And this is Albania's largest island. It's about 5 kilometers long. It sits at a point where the Adriatic meets the Ionian Sea. It was a military base throughout the 20th century, Italian, then Soviet, then Albanian. And after the regime collapsed in 1991, it was looted. By 2021, it was a Cold War ghost town with 16 kilometers of tunnels, 3,600 bunkers, unexploded ordnance, and almost no tourists because they had been closed to the public. Ivanka later described the experience on the Lex Fridman podcast, quote, "We swam to the island, we went on a hike barefoot to the top, and we were just captivated," quote. And she said, quote unquote, "And over the course of many years, we developed the opportunity to help realize its potential." Develop the opportunity is doing a lot of work in that sentence, by the way. Let me tell you what developing that opportunity actually involved. First, there was legal engineering. Eddie Rama met Kushner on that same yacht trip. and they had conversations about investment opportunities. In March 2024, Kushner publicly announced through a Bloomberg interview that Affinity Partners was planning to develop Sazan Island as a luxury eco-resort partnering with Amin Resorts on the hotel brand. What Kushner did not mention in that announcement, and what became clear only later, was the sequence of legal changes that had already been made to enable this project. In February 2024, Albania's parliament passed an amendment to the Protected Areas Law. The amendment removed the ban on construction in designated protected areas, specifically for, and I'm quoting directly, structures of excellence 5 stars or more. 5-star hotels and related hospitality activities were now exempted from restrictions on building in protected ecological zones. Environmental groups at BirdLife immediately connected this amendment to the Kushner project. The timing was too difficult to ignore. The law changed. Then a Kushner-linked resort was announced for the protected area the law now covered. And then in December 2025, the Albanian government also declassified Sazan Island for civilian use, ending its military status. On December 30th, 2024, according to investigative reporting, the government granted the Sazan project official strategic investor status. Strategic investor designation unlocks fast-track permits and long-term leases. The terms, according to reporting by The Guardian, were extraordinary. Affinity Partners and its partners would reportedly pay no taxes during the construction phase. The Albanian government would underwrite the infrastructure. I'm talking water, electricity, and sewage. Now let's follow the money, because this is where it gets genuinely murky. The company that secured development permits for the coastal area near Zvernice, the mainland portion of the project, is called Zvernice South Adriatic Development. So Reporter.al, the Albanian outlet of the Balkan Investigative Reporting Network, reported that this company was established in August 2024 and is owned by Dutch Trust Management BV, a Dutch trust structure that obscures the identities of the ultimate beneficial owners. Through a network of shell companies, the development is linked to Qatari investor brothers Ramez and Mohammed Al-Kihat. The company had also secured 2 development permits from the National Territorial Council that, crucially, have never been officially published. Not disclosed to Parliament, not disclosed to the public, not disclosed to the residents of Zvernice, who found out about the project when bulldozers showed up. In June 2026, SPAC, Albania's anti-corruption prosecutors, ordered a preventative seizure of assets from Albania Land Development, owned by those same Qatari investors, amid a widening investigation into allegedly fraudulent property titles. The land being purchased, like much of the Albanian coastal property, was subject to competing claims dating from the chaotic post-communist privatizations of the 1990s. Now, before we get to the protests, here's one contextual note. This isn't the first time that Kushner has tried this in this region. In November 2025, Serbia's parliament passed a special law to enable a luxury complex in Belgrade financed by a Kushner-linked investment company, a proposal to develop the general staff buildings destroyed during NATO bombing in 1999. That project ultimately did not proceed. It was abandoned after similar public outcry. The pattern is consistent. A Kushner-linked fund, sovereign wealth capital from Gulf states, a government eager for American goodwill, special legislation fast-tracking the project past normal environmental review, and secrecy about the terms until bulldozers appear. What was different in Albania was what happened next. On May 23, 2026, protests began in the Albanian village of Zvernice, right at the edge of the Narda Lagoon. And it was like a few hundred people that showed up. A week later, on May 30th, private security guards assaulted and physically dragged a protester inside the fenced construction zone. This was caught on camera. Police were present. They watched. They did not intervene. But the next day, Tirana erupted. The conservation group PPNEA, Protection and Preservation of the Natural Environment in Albania, had been raising alarms about this for a month. Their executive leader told CBS News there was no public consultation whatsoever. There was nobody who was informed. Just one day, we saw bulldozers entering outside, opening up roads, cutting trees, destroying the dunes, and the public knew nothing. During early construction surveys in April 2026, at least one sea turtle nest was destroyed by bulldozers. The Vjosa Narda wetland is a stop on one of Europe's most important migratory bird routes. It hosts flamingos, it hosts Mediterranean monk seals, it hosts loggerhead sea turtles. It has been a protected landscape since 2004 and a national marine park in the surrounding waters since 2010. The Vjosa River, which feeds the wetland, has been declared one of Europe's first wild river national parks in 2023. And bulldozers showed up without valid permits, without an environmental assessment, without telling anybody. The protesters adopted the flamingo as their symbol, and it's worth pausing on why that works so well. Flamingos are not small, subtle creatures. They're pink. They're unmistakable. They nest in exactly the kind of shallow lagoon system that the Vjosa Narda project would destroy. And there's something almost absurdist about a luxury hotel developer versus a flock of flamingos. But the symbol carried weight beyond the absurdity. For Albanians, the flamingo represented something that can't be bought back once it's gone. The protesters weren't just defending birds, they were defending a principle that some things belong to everyone. That a government cannot simply hand your coastline to a billionaire's son-in-law without asking you. The movement was explicitly nonpartisan. The imagery replaced the eagle on Albania's flag with a flamingo, and they changed the red background to blue, referencing the sea. And as Balkan Web noted, the flamingo was a civic symbol not associated with any existing Albanian political party. Over 100,000 people marched in Tirana in the first 18 days. Protests then spread to other major cities across Albania. The Albanian diaspora mobilized from Brussels to New York to Sydney to Rome, marching under the slogan, "We have no land to sell." These protests were different in character from previous Albanian political unrest. Observers noticed that the demonstrators handed out flowers, sang songs, picked up litter after marches. They brought their children, they brought their grandparents. Parents who told their kids to stay home started showing up. And the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung described it as a quote-unquote genuinely transgenerational refusal, which I love. I think that's beautiful. The protesters' demands were very specific. Cancel the project, repeal the 2024 amendments to the Protected Areas Law, transparent publication of all permits, studies, and agreements, independent environmental impact assessments aligned with EU standards, and Rama's resignation. On June 10th, the protests deliberately aligned themselves with the 148th anniversary of the League of Prizren. Now, for listeners who are not familiar with that, the League of Prizren was a congress of Albanian leaders in 1878 when Albanians from 5 Ottoman provinces gathered to coordinate their political position. It's considered one of the founding moments of Albanian national consciousness. And the 2026 protests used the slogan Prizren 1878, Tirana 2026, with banners comparing the 19th century gathering of Albanians from 5 vilayets to the 21st century gathering of Albanians from 5 continents. That's not just symbolism, that's a claim that protecting Albanian land from what they saw as corrupt politicians selling it to foreign interests is the same moral project as resistant Ottoman rule. Heavy framing, but that is the emotional register of the moment. And of course, Edi Rama, he did not resign. He did not cancel the project. He's actually committed to this project, and he's escalated the situation. First, he denied the scale of the protests, describing them as a couple hundred people with an axe to grind. When they grew too large to dismiss, and the international media forced Albania's government-aligned domestic press to cover them, Rama called the movement a hybrid war waged by actors using the sentiments of some well-meaning people about the environment, suggesting Iranian and Russian interference. I posted about this too. He also said it was AI, that the protests were all AI. And he literally went on CNN and denied everything as the cameras were playing, everything that was happening. So go check out my Instagram, Radical Leftist Scum. But also in an interview with MS Now, Rama defended the project as Albania's ticket to the Champions League of global tourism, dismissed the corruption accusations as quote unquote very fashionable words. Instead of the American media's attention, you want me to believe that suddenly the American media, the American influencers, the American world is caring about some flamingos in Albania? Don't come here to fight with Trump. It's not your fight. Ooh. That line, don't come here to fight with Trump, is telling. Rama was framing the opposition as foreign interference, framing Albanian citizens marching in their own capital as proxies for geopolitical enemies. This is not the rhetoric of a government confident in the legitimacy of what it's done. Albania has been a candidate for EU membership since 2014. It's actually considered one of the frontrunners along like the Western Balkans candidates. Technical negotiations are expected to close at the end of 2027. Rama has set a public target of membership by 2030. But that accession timeline is now at very serious risk. EU membership requires compliance with what's called Chapter 27, Environmental Standards. The Vjosa Narda project, which began construction inside a protected area without permits or environmental assessment, is a direct violation of the commitments Albania has made as part of these negotiations. The European Commission was measured in its response, and some critics would say probably too measured. A Commission spokesperson said Albania should refrain from actions that could undermine the fulfillment of the closing benchmarks and act without delay. The Commissioner for Enlargement, Marta Kos, largely deferred to Albanian institutions, expressing confidence in SPAC. The European Parliament was less diplomatic. On June 17, 2026, the Parliament adopted its annual resolution on the Commission's report on Albania. It included a specific demand, an immediate moratorium on new permits and construction in Albania's protected areas to remain in effect until 2024 amendments of the Protected Areas Law are repealed and full compliance with EU environmental standards is demonstrated. BirdLife's head of policy summarized the position clearly. We want Albania in the European family, and that's precisely why we cannot afford to get this wrong. There's a structural tension here that's worth naming. The EU needs Albania's cooperation in migration flows, on organized crime, and Western Balkan stability. Brussels has consistently avoided hard conditionality with Tirana because of Rama. For all his flaws, has been broadly pro-European in a neighborhood where pro-European governments are not guaranteed. That creates a soft enforcement problem. The rules exist, but applying them rigidly risks pushing a fragile government toward the alternatives. The Flamingo Revolution has put that calculation under pressure. For the first time in years, there is real domestic pressure in Albania pushing in the same direction as EU conditionality. Whether Brussels chooses to use that leverage or lets the moment pass will tell you a great deal about whether EU enlargement is a process or just a promise. All right, let me pull this all together now. The Flamingo Revolution is not simply about a resort. It is about the accumulated weight of 35 years of a political system that treats public assets as private patronage. The Vjosa Narda deal follows a pattern. A law is quietly amended. A company is quietly granted strategic investor status. Permits are issued without publication. Bulldozers arrive. And the people whose land this is, whose heritage this is, who spilled blood on this land, whose future this is, find out the way that the residents of Zvernitz found out, when the fences go up. What makes the Kushner connection significant is not just the obvious conflict of interest optics, the son-in-law of a sitting U.S. president receiving preferential treatment from a government eager for American goodwill. What makes it significant is that it exposed, with unusual clarity, the mechanism, the way the Albanian state actually works, and for whom. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace has a name for this pattern in the Western Balkans context. It's called corrosive capital. They call it corrosive capital. Foreign investment that comes bundled with political influence and institutional erosion. The deal itself becomes the mechanism for capture. So the investor needs the politician needs the investor's legitimacy and the foreign goodwill that they represent. And the public land, the environmental protection, and the procurement process, well, those are the price of the transaction. Look, Albania is not unique in this, but the Flamingo Revolution has made the pattern visible in a way that it usually isn't. People can see the flamingos, people can see the fences, people can understand no environmental assessment without a law degree. The abstraction of institutional capture becomes concrete. There's something historically significant about what the 2026 protesters were demanding. Not a change of party, not a coalition reshuffle, a different political contract. The Institute Jacques Delors, in their analysis of the Flamingo movement, framed it in this way. Albania's protests reveal a deeper malaise. The chants calling for both Rama and Berisha to face justice reflect just a broad rejection of the two dominant political camps. And it also demonstrates fatigue with the country's political elites across 30 years. For a country that has never, in its democratic history, produced a credible political alternative to the two-party system, that is a significant development. So I want to be honest about what we don't know. What we don't know is whether Edi Rama personally profited from this Kushner deal. We can all make assumptions, but SPAC is investigating, but no charges have been filed against Rama himself. The investigative reporting has been focused on the land sellers, the shell companies, and the 2024 legal amendments, not on personal corruption by the prime minister. So we don't really know. That's all I'm going to say about that. We also don't know whether the project will actually be canceled. Rama has repeatedly said it won't be, over and over again. He says we're moving forward, it's going to happen. So I don't know what's going to happen there. And we don't know whether the Flamingo Revolution will translate into lasting political change or whether it'll be absorbed by the system the way previous Albanian protest movements have been. And honestly, we don't even know what the role that geopolitics is playing here. Rama's claim that protests are a hybrid war is almost currently exaggerated, like political self-defense, and he's calling things fake news, kind of like Donald Trump. But it's also true that the Western Balkans is a region where external actors, Russia, China, Turkey, the Gulf states, and yes, the United States, all have active interests. The Kushner deal is itself an expression of those interests. And let's not forget Israel. Israel's always behind everything, especially with this. Here's the question I keep coming back to, and I want to leave it with you. Albania is a country that has kept for 45 years in a condition of enforced ignorance and political passivity. People were not allowed to organize. They were not allowed to dissent. They were not allowed to own property or leave or believe in God or learn what was happening in the world. After that, after 1997, after 30 years of two parties trading corruption, these people who went into the streets in the hundreds of thousands, not for a party, not for a politician, for flamingos, for a lagoon, for the idea that their country is not for sale. And whether that holds, whether it translates, whether the institutions that are supposed to respond to democratic pressure actually respond, that's the question. Albania has never been more ready to answer it. Whether it does depends, as it always has, on whether enough people keep showing up. If you have found this episode valuable, share it. Specifically, share with people who know nothing about Albania. This story is too important and too revealing about how power actually works to stay inside a Balkan political niche. The Flamingo Revolution is not a local story. It's a story about what democracy requires and what it costs when you don't have it. Especially for my friends in the United States, we are going through it right now with our own regime, with our own corrupted government. Let Albania inspire us. Let Albania shine a light into how we solve things. They are our inspiration. And to my fellow Albanians, keep it up. We're here for you. We support you. Thank you, everyone. Bye.